Hey everybody, welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast, where we're helping ODs all over the country make better and better decisions around their money, their careers, and their practices. I am your host, Evon certified financial planner practitioner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, an independent financial planning firm just for optometrists nationwide. And thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate your time and your attention today. And on today's episode, we are going to dive into how optometry practice owners can plan 5 to 10 years away from a practice exit to maximize and maintain the value of the practice. And for that, I'm joined by Erich Mattei of Akrinos, who does a ton of work around practice transitions as well as practice valuation work. And Erich's been on the podcast several times. We're going to dive into different aspects of the business that owners should look at improving as we are preparing and leading up to the sale and exit of the practice. And whether you're someone who's thinking about that 5 to 10 years away, or maybe you're a buyer thinking about that yourself, I think you're going to get a lot out of this episode. And I'll put all of Erich's contact information and all the resource we mentioned here in the episode in the show notes, including that resource Erich talks about at the end of the episode, which you can find in the app you're using to listen to the podcast or at the education hub of our website, www.optometrywealth.com. And of course, reach out to me if you have any questions, podcast@optometrywealth.com. And if you'd like someone to help you plan around the financial aspects of exiting your practice and planning for retirement and financial independence, reach out. You can use the link in the show notes to schedule a no-commitment introductory call. We can talk about all that's on your mind financially, and we can share how we help ODs all over the country navigate those same decisions and more. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Erich Mattei. Welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast. I am your host, Evon Mindrin. I am excited to be joined once again by friend of the podcast, friend of the show. Are we there yet, Erich? Mr. Erich Mattei. Glad to have you back on.
I would say so, Evon. Absolutely. And it is a pleasure and privilege to join you here on this episode of Optometry Money Podcast.
Perfect. I want to dive into a topic or set of questions that I'm finding more and more in my conversations with clients, both current clients and new clients as they're coming in to work with our firm. And that's planning for the eventual exit out of the practice. And we are usually talking through in the context of planning for retirement preparation. We are modeling out different scenarios. We're talking to them about how they might want to exit their practice, who they might want to transition to, modeling out different values of the business, modeling out different structures of that. And inevitably, as we go through that conversation, the questions come up, okay, what do we do inside of our business to either improve the value of the business as we get closer to that point, or to not lower the value of the business as we get closer to that point? And so all of these things, Erich, are right up your alley. You, in your consulting work, in your valuation work, all of the work you do around practice transitions. I couldn't think of anyone better to have this conversation with. I just want to start with the first question to sort of lay the groundwork a little bit. And that's, when you think about the value of a practice or any business, what are the basic inputs of that value? What information needs to be used to sort of determine what a fair price of a practice should be?
Yeah, Evon, I tell you, that is an excellent question. And I think a question that as an industry, we need to all be really tuned into. Because why? Private equity, having come into the eye care space about 10 years ago, has definitely disrupted the transition marketplace. But what's interesting is that as we've seen this significant decline in the prevalence of these private equity deals since they hit their peak in 2021, as we've seen this decline, we're realizing now we're having to, I don't want to say reteach the industry on proper valuation methods, but clearly there's a big difference between valuing a business at fair market value versus valuing a business based on some multiple of an earnings basis measure that some outside investor, namely private equity, is going to slap on a practice. All of these reasons, I think this is really important right now that we unpack this. So to kick this off, I think it's vitally important that everyone understand, what are we looking to accomplish in deriving a fair market value? And fair market value, by definition, would be the price that, in this case, a business would change hands between a willing and able buyer and a willing and able seller acting on their own accord and keeping the transaction at an arm's length. All of this technical jargon to say fair market value is the price that works based on how the business is cash flowing. And that is emphatically the big distinguishing feature between a private sale, which we're seeing continue to accelerate as far as doctors entering private sale, versus private equity sale, which we're seeing continuing to be on the decline. Okay, so it's really important that everybody out there understand, first and foremost, fair market value is really how we need to be looking at these businesses. How are they cash flowing in such a way that a willing and able buyer can come in, secure financing, purchase from the seller, be able to pay themselves, the new owner, a living wage as a doctor. Don't worry, your high on the hog wages will come down the line when you're further into ownership. But effectively, out of the gates, we're looking at this through the lens of what is the price where a buyer can borrow money, pay the seller, and based on how the business performs, that buyer can pay themselves a living wage as a doctor and have sufficient funds remaining to cover the debt. And Evon, I gotta tell you, there's a lot of things. We could have hours upon hours of episodes where we're weaving in and out and talking about add backs and talking about all these little intricacies. But at the end of the day, this is all extremely basic math, basic concepts. And perhaps in the course of this episode, I'll help more doctors understand it a little bit more. But really, the first key piece that I want everybody to understand and tie back to is that it's got to be about cash flowing.
Yep.
And that's what we're going to spend this episode talking about, is helping doctors better understand how to evaluate these businesses based on cash flow. And specifically for our sellers out there, what can you do to preserve, if not increase, your value as you're eyeing your exit in the next few years?
And so theoretically, the value of any business, including an optometry practice, is the future cash flow that you're going to earn, adjusted by the reliability or unreliability of that future cash flow coming in. And it does seem to matter who is buying that practice, right? If it's between two willing buyers, it does sound like it matters who those two willing buyers are. Obviously, the selling doctor is that first willing buyer. It does seem to matter who's on the other side of that in terms of what that fair price might be between those two parties. And when you think about let's start with just a single doctor practice, no associate doctors, right? So single owner, single doctor, as they are preparing, let's say 10 to 5 years away from planning to exit, what should they be looking at in terms of their business, improvements in their business, financially, operations-wise? What should they be looking at improving or changing that have the highest impact on that price later on?
Yeah. Evon, that is a really great question. That is very much a loaded question.
Okay.
Because believe it or not, it's going to vary by the doctor. Yes, you can have two doctors. Imagine this. Imagine two single owner practices in virtually identical markets, grossing the same. But this is where we start to get into differences, okay? Because there are two key pieces I would like everyone to really focus on. If we're putting ourselves in the shoes of one of these two sellers, what can I do? I'm 5 to 10 years out. What can I do? There's two things that matter: profitability and capital expenditure.
Okay.
So when we talk profitability, this is what I was referencing earlier. We were talking about fair market value and how do we construct a fair market value on a business. And it's based on how these things are cash flowing. Typically we'll use a process known as capitalization of earnings, but that's one of only a few different methods that are used that need to be selected based on the merits of the project and exactly what are the objectives on the project. If we're looking at these two single owner practices, we're talking profitability, we're talking capital expenditure. So let's think of all of those things that impact profitability. So remember, profit, we have revenue, dollars coming in, we have expenses, dollars flowing out, and what's left over is profit. And then we take that profit and we add back whatever wages we paid ourselves as a doctor. Now we've got kind of this optometric net. We'll have to make a little adjustment for an associate, but nonetheless, we come to understand what is the true profitability of the business for a single owner operator business. So what are the things that are going to impact profit? Revenue, right? If we have the same expense setup ratios and our revenue increases, that's going to result in an increase in profit. Now, by the same token, what if revenues remain stagnant? Can we grow profitability? We can, but how do you grow profitability when revenues are stagnant? We need to find ways to lower expenses. So if we're looking at what to do to drive profit, we've got revenue growth, we've got expense reduction. Low-hanging fruit on the expense reduction side. I would imagine our viewers out there are familiar with these concepts of benchmarks and expense benchmarking. As a matter of fact, Evon, I think I may have joined the show in a prior episode. We were talking about expense benchmarks.
I believe so.
Huge opportunity for anyone eyeing exit in next 5 to 10 years. Dare I say, y'all, even if you're only a few years into ownership and you're not looking to exit for the next 30 years, roll your sleeves up and let's see what we can do to fix your benchmarks. So we look across your different expense categories. You're going to have cost of goods sold. What is this? These are the costs you're paying for any items that are selling through your practice. Frames, ophthalmic lenses, lab costs, contact lens. If you are a member of our Alliance Buy Group, you definitely want to include those fees, those Alliance fees and COGS, because that's going to paint a more realistic picture of exactly what's going on here with the COGS. But we have COGS, cost of goods sold. Next up is going to be occupancy. So think here, anything that goes into the physical space, our rent, repairs and maintenance, utilities. Then we jump into non-doctor payroll. Who's that going to be? Take a guess. Anyone on payroll who's not a doctor.
Right.
And lastly is going to be that general overhead. So for all intents and purposes, Evon, when you're looking at practices, there are different benchmarks that one is going to want to fall in based on how big the practice is. So without going into the granular details of the differing benchmarks as the business grows, generically speaking, for our COGS, we're looking for 25 to 30% expense. For our occupancy, we're looking at 6 to 9% in expense. Our non-doctor payroll, about 18 to 24% of our expense. And lastly, general overhead being 3 to 5% of operating expenses. So all of this to say, if you're 5 to 10 years out and your COGS are at 33%, there is money on the table. Do it. Get those COGS not only below 30%, see how close you can get them down to 25%. Huge opportunity. Cost reductions in COGS go straight to the bottom line, straight to the profit. Next up is going to be occupancy. Now, occupancy is an interesting one because occupancy, how easy is it just to go in and renegotiate a lease midterm?
Right.
Depends on who you ask. By the way, there are some commercial realtors out there that do amazing jobs of negotiating leases. But for all intents and purposes, and for many cases, going in and adjusting occupancy expense, it's off the table. So when we look at adjusting an occupancy expense, it's not so much a matter of reducing that expense. Maybe we can, depending on where we are in the terms of the lease, and if we've got a commercial realtor in our market that really has the chops and understands how to do this. But for all intents and purposes, occupancy is one of those that it's not one of those levers you can easily move like COGS. So when we look at occupancy, how do we move that expense benchmark? We got to grow the revenue.
I was just going to say.
So that's shining a light. If we're seeing occupancy is 12%, I would argue that means this location has the ability to generate more revenue. We got to figure out how to do that.
So I was just going to say that makes perfect sense. Cost of goods sold being typically a variable cost that's going to change based on gross revenues, based on your patient activity, right? Occupancy costs being a fixed cost, unless you own your own building or are willing to adjust the rent that you're paying yourself. Typically, there's not too much wiggle room, perhaps utilities, things like that, janitorial services. But for the most part, occupancy cost is going to be a fixed cost. But as you mentioned, you can adjust the percentage of revenue that occupancy costs are going to by increasing revenue. So that opportunity is really more on the improving the revenue side. Unfortunately, not necessarily too strongly on the improving the expense side. And then you mentioned a few others. You mentioned non-OD staff costs, which may be fixed, may be partly variable, depending on perhaps optician pay, depending on the incentives there. Talk to us about non-OD staff costs.
Okay, so when we're looking at our non-doctor staffing costs, these are going to range between 18 and 24% of expenses. So, remarkable opportunity here to do what? Get us in line. And this is another one of these examples of where I'll say, look, if we're looking at our non-doctor payroll costs and we're up at 28 or 29%, what does this mean? Well, it can mean a number of things. And by the way, one thing that it does not mean is do not go and clean house.
Okay.
So please, if you're doing a benchmarking analysis of your practice and you're seeing your non-doctor payroll is above this range we're going for, don't think that, oh, Eric was on Evon's show and said I can just start firing people. No, it's not what we want to do.
Hey, Eric, we magically brought non-OD staff costs from 25% to zero. Doesn't that work?
Unfortunately not.
Okay.
So the way to look at this then, if you're 5 to 10 years out and you see that your non-doctor payroll is above benchmark, that benchmark limit being 18 to 24%, if it's above, this is where I would argue that means that this team can produce more. Now, things do get interesting, Evon, when you dig a little bit deeper into that payroll side of things. For example, do we have 2 staff members that we are paying $15 an hour for performance, where we could alternatively have 1 staff member that we're paying $27 an hour that's able to accomplish everything they can do and do it X% better? What we have discovered in our work here at Akrinos is that many practices that are finding their non-doctor payroll is out of whack and some other HR type things, many of these are ready to take the step and graduate into more professional support in their office. What do I mean by that? And by the way, if you're out there and I'm speaking to you, I'm speaking your language, and you're looking around and you're like, dude, Eric, yeah, my non-doctor payroll is close to 30%. And dude, yeah, I have a lot of staff members in my office. Do a quick calculation, y'all. Take your gross revenue, so your gross collections for the year. So maybe look back at 25. What were your gross collections you brought in for the year? Look at that non-doctor payroll. See what percent of total collections is non-doctor payroll. But then I'm going to want you to take a step further. I want you to take that gross revenue collected and divide it by 200,000. What is this 200,000 figure I speak of? It's a generic, and by the way, this is very generic. So if you want to get more granular into your market specifics, I'd love to explore that with you. But generically speaking, a staff member is going to generate around 200,000 of revenue for the practice. By the way, on the lower end, it's more like 155, 160. On the higher end, it may be pushing upwards of 250. What are the differences there? Well, if we take our gross collected revenue and divide it by our head count of full-time non-doctor employees, if that figure is coming in at around 155, 160, 165, compared to that figure coming in more in like the 235, 240, 245, effectively what you got is here, where we have a lot of staff members to achieve our revenue. Here, there's a lot of inefficiency. There's probably a lot of redundancy. And I'm willing to bet there's a lot of folks who are amazing people. We're not saying anything about people as humans, But in the context of the workplace and executing the responsibilities of the role, there's opportunity for improvement. Whereas you look at this practice over here that may have the same collected revenue, but is operating with less staff members, that means what? They're a more efficient, more proficient, and more competent staff.
Got it. Okay.
And that is huge. That is a huge exercise. What you got, Evon?
So what it sounds like is that, as you mentioned, improving the percentage of revenue going towards non-OD staff cost isn't about clearing house, right? It's not necessarily just about removing that investment altogether, but it's about increasing the efficiency with the staff that you have. And maybe similar to the occupancy costs, right? It's about finding out ways to use that investment line item on your profit and loss more efficiently. And I really appreciate you providing some benchmark numbers there to think about in terms of revenue per full-time equivalent staff. But it does sound like some part of that at least is looking at the team as it is and making sure that the right butts are on the right seat in the bus, so to speak. Like you have the proper people in the proper roles doing the right work for that person. At least a part of it, evaluating the team and just making sure you have the right people there in the right roles. Is that right?
Yeah. And in so doing, Evon, what that does, so look, if you're listening to us and you are 5 to 10 years from exit, and you do have a little bit of a turnover issue in your office, and you don't have those rock stars that really know how to run your office, and if everything is still falling on your shoulders, these are all of the signs that we see. And I'll tell you right now, if I just identified you, I'm willing to bet that you are overstaffed and you're underpaying. Overstaffed and underpaying, and in as much, your benchmarks are out of whack. And it seems really counterintuitive. Wait up, Eric, what do you mean? I'm paying as cheap as I can pay somebody that's willing to take a job. Well, yeah, that's exactly my point. Because now you're needing 2x the headcount to do that. And all of the things, everything cascades from that. So that's where we've realized, whoa, what if we tighten up HR? And by the way, Evon, it's not as simple as just the right butts and the right chairs. And I know, the Wickman book, Gino Wickman book, Traction, right. A great book, right? Entrepreneurial operating system, great concepts. I know it's something that much of optometry has embraced. But dare I say it's not as easy as that. As a matter of fact, we discover at times that's some of the issue is that folks think it's as easy as just that. No, it's a heck of a lot more complex than just reading a paperback and then thinking like it's going to happen like magic. So specifically, we get into job descriptions and organizational structure. Who is doing what in your office and how are they doing it and who are they reporting to? Team meetings, training organizer. What are the level of competencies and how are we developing our people? Performance and development. How are we developing individual people to become better at what they do? Let's stop looking at our staff as $15 an hour necessity and start looking at our staff as $25 an hour investment. And that's the kind of stuff, like, Evon, people ask me all the time, Eric, y'all have only been at this 5 years. They're doing amazing things. What is it? It's things like this. It's challenging the status quo. It's helping doctors look at the business as a business, not as a practice, but as a business. So really, really great stuff here. Next up is general overhead. So we touched on our non-doctor payroll. By the way, any listeners out there who would like to unpack this one-on-one, would love to, because this is a really fascinating arena, right? This whole world of non-doctor payroll. But last but not least, let's get to our general overhead. And that general overhead should be in the 3 to 5% range. So if you're running an expense analysis and you're seeing that general overhead is 8%, 10, 12%, 15, 16%, I'm willing to bet that you're doing a lot of personal living through your business. Mm-hmm. And while that personal living through your business may have been great for all these years that you've been able to pay less taxes, as you're looking to exit in the next 5 to 10 years, running personal through business just makes your business look less profitable.
Yeah.
And if you think back to how we started our conversation around fair market value, profitability is number one. So it's very important that you are honest with yourself in evaluating what expenses are you putting on your business credit card versus your personal household credit card, and that you start to get a bit more disciplined with those. Now, if you find yourself behaving in such a way because CPA is running your business financials the way they are, that may be a sign that you need to find another CPA to work with. So follow me on this. If we're running household expense through our business because our CPA isn't good at tax strategy for us, then I'm going to say, we have got to get your household expenses out of your business. It's going to destroy your fair market value, or you're going to have to argue for the add backs.
Yeah.
And Evon, maybe that's a separate episode altogether. What are add backs and evaluation?
I think so.
You don't want, as a seller, you don't want to have to be justifying your add backs. Yeah. That doesn't look good to a prospective buyer. Think about it. You're having to write a story about the reason why your financials look that way. It's not a good look. Also, banks hate it. Lenders hate it when you got a seller that has more add backs than there are days in the calendar year. That's just not a good look.
Yeah.
So if we want to be serious about selling our business, we got to get serious on cleaning the business up. So get those personal expenses, also known as discretionary spend, owner discretionary, get that slush fund out of the business. And if you're hesitant to do it because it means you're going to be paying a bunch of taxes, I think you probably need to find a new CPA that is a bit more proactive in the tax strategy side of things.
No, I fully agree. I am in favor of a pretty clean separation between business activity and household spending for a number of reasons. I think very often we are too keen on pushing the boundaries between what is legitimately a deductible business expense versus what's in reality a personal expense. That's not usually on the tax professional. That is most often on the optometrist. So I think we need to be a little bit more honest in that and lean on the guidance of our professionals. But that's number one. I think number two, as you mentioned, it becomes difficult to know what the practice is spending and what the household is spending. And without clarity on both, it becomes more difficult to plan financially. We don't really know what's being spent in the household because a lot of it's mixed in with what's in the practice. You don't have clarity around what your available cash flow is to do stuff with. And for me, like, I see both of it because I'm looking through the practice financials and the household financials. But if that is not happening, it's hard to connect those two and to pull out what's real. So if you want real clarity on what's going on financially in the practice separately and in the household separately and make really good decisions, you got to separate those out. And it does impact the value. Otherwise, you have to start to argue for those add backs, like Erich says. So yeah. I appreciate you bringing that up. I think that's a huge opportunity to just clean things up. And a lot of that starts with having like clean books in the first place to know, to even be able to look at and know what's going on. Or at a minimum, optometrists, like, have those come out as distributions and not as expenses, because usually they're not real business expenses. Glad you mentioned that. We've talked through all these different categories. It does sound like the two opportunities to improve the expenses themselves are in cost of goods or in inventory costs and general administrative expenses. It sounds like when you are trying to improve the percentage of revenue going towards occupancy costs and non-OD staff, very often it's more about improving efficiency, which it sounds like it's really more about improving the revenue side, not necessarily the expense side. So let's talk a little bit about revenue. How are we thinking about improving the revenue side of the profit and loss?
Yeah. Outstanding question there, Evon. Jumping into revenue, you're 5 to 10 years out. Make these the best damn 5 to 10 years your business has ever seen. And you might be thinking to yourself, Erich, dude, I've been working my ass off for decades. I don't think I got it in me. Doc, I hate to say it, but one of two things going to happen. One, you're going to take your foot off the gas and all those decades of working your ass off is going to go up at a fraction of what it could have been. Or two, you'll do it and you'll see that you're going to be able to sell this thing for a hell of a lot more than you would have had you let this thing glide. Okay. And that's really, those are the points that I wanted to make here, Evon. It has to do with growth versus stagnation versus comparison to benchmark.
Okay.
Put yourself as a seller eyeing 5 to 10 year exit. Put yourself in the shoes of a buyer. Whether that buyer is independent or if that buyer is a consolidator, a private equity. Think through their lens. What do they want to see? Do they want to see something that is stagnant, that is teetering on the brink, that has these things all over the place, even if it's making decent money? Like, even if the business has strong benchmarks, you can have the best financials in the world, but if your business has been flat, stagnant for the last 5 years, whoo-hoo, you may have to do some explaining to justify if you're going to want to be really digging your heels on negotiation. Because any buyer that knows what's up, certainly expect any buyer that's working with Akrinos, we're going to pick your practice apart and find our buyer a hella good price in the process. As it were, right? Be sure that revenue continues to grow. Does it have to grow double digit? Does it have to grow 15 and 20% the way it did back when you were in your prime? No, it doesn't have to do that. But if you could just show some nice single digit growth, heck, I think the industry last year grew low single digits. So even if you could show like a 5 or 6% growth of just collected revenue, that's nice, right? So please don't think that when I'm saying, hey, we got to be sure revenue is growing, it doesn't have to be growing like this. Just a nice, steady, do the basics, increase your professional fees, work on the basics with handoff, with sales in your optical. What's that AR looking like? Let's get that revenue in the door. Let's get rid of these days of having the biller that we know is notorious for writing things off, but we never really had the oomph to go and tell them they need to really get their act together. This is the kind of stuff, Evon, 5 to 10 years out, this is the opportunity to fix that stuff.
Yeah.
But also something else on the revenue side that I think is really important. Old Bob Dylan lyric, the times they are a-changing. The times they are a-changing as it pertains to revenue and payor mix. Okay. And this is something that I think is really important, that as an industry and particularly as a profession, y'all, we really need to get serious about this stuff. We can't rely on managed care anymore. We just can't. So I don't know how many of you caught this headline, but last year it was I forget if it was Q3 or Q4 of 2025, but there was news released where CMS announced that they were not increasing. There was something about a change that they were making with regard to Medicare Advantage plans. And when CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, when CMS released this statement, again, it was either in Q3 or Q4 of 2025, but CMS released this statement, and then United Healthcare stock plummeted by 20% in a single day. I actually dropped a little video in LinkedIn on this, just one of my personal commentaries. But y'all, if you read between the lines of what this is saying, it's saying the market does not like managed care. Okay. Think about it. If CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, makes a big announcement and it shakes stock price of one of the biggest insurers to that degree, we need to realize the free market, right? Because stocks, United Health is traded, I forget if it's on the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange, what have you, or the Dow, right? But nonetheless, it's traded on this public market, and the public market ain't liking it.
Yeah.
So wake up call here. Wake up call. We want as much dollars as we can to be flowing into this business directly from patients. We want to minimize the presence of insurance. When managed care is involved in our practice, we want to minimize vision plans and favor medical plans. So it's really important as we're looking to increase revenue, it's not done in a way that actually shoots ourselves in the foot. Because if we're thinking we're going to increase revenue by pulling out all the stops, get on all the vision plans, and just treat any patient that comes in the door, revenue may grow, but are we really growing revenue in the way we want? Or are we simply digging our hole deeper and faster than others? And that's like, right, by the way, that's an analogy. Clients out there know that this is an analogy I love to use. We're digging a hole. We feel like we're working hard. How deep are we going? Okay. We're working hard, but we're also digging a big old hole. So it's really important. And consider this to any of our listeners out there. If you had an opportunity to buy a practice that was 100% managed care versus 100% cash pay, which would you take and why? So we need to look at that and realize that payor mix, cash, vision plans, medical, and government, depending on how that payor mix is, will have a material impact on the value of the business, and it will absolutely have an impact on your ability to maintain posture when it comes time to negotiation. And I'll tell you, if you are one of these practices and you're looking to sell and your buyer works with a group like Akrinos, we're going to pick this thing apart and they're going to get it at a really good price. Really important that everyone understand we don't just want to start growing revenue, but we want to grow the right revenue through the right channels.
Yep. So I'm curious. So when I think about a framework that I've adopted from others of what impacts gross revenue in a practice, it's revenue per exam or revenue per patient times the amount of patients per doctor day times the amount of doctor days per year. And you can boil down this very simple formula to boil down the amount of gross revenue you might earn in a year. So you can look at each of those and say, which of these do I have the ability to improve most? And one way it sounds like to improve the revenue per exam or revenue per patient is by improving the patient mix. It is by improving the mix and types of patients that you are seeing and gaining revenue from, because that's going to have a direct impact on how much revenue you actually collect, not necessarily bill on, but actually collect. And when you're looking at that from your perspective, like if you're helping a buyer, are you looking at the patient mix directly? And is that patient mix directly impacting the price that buyer is reasonably willing to pay? Or is it simply that it's impacting the revenue, and the revenue is really what you're basing that on? Like, how much are you looking directly at the patient mix and thinking about what price is fair for the buyer to pay?
Yes and yes,
Okay.
Because it ties back to risk.
Yep.
And this is something I'm realizing, perhaps we'll have to have another conversation totally just around valuations. What are these things? How do they work? What are all these variables that are being pulled in? Because it all ties back to the risk. So what happens is that, consider this, a practice that is 100% cash pay versus a practice that is 100% vision plan. 100% vision plan is radically riskier than 100% cash pay. So that will play out. It can play out in the valuation when we're building up the discount rate, the equity discount rate, where that risk of the individual practice is ramped there, right? It would also play on the other side with negotiation. And this is where things get really interesting when we look at some of the... Let's let our conversation continue to unfold. I don't want to go on another tangent here, but it's really fascinating, man. It really is. It's fascinating how all this stuff operates, and the importance, though, of realizing that when we can tie it back to these business basics, and look at it in that way and get diligent about doing things that need to be done from the business standpoint. This has nothing to do with patient care, with practice, with all that stuff. I'm talking just pure the business side of these things. It can be huge. But please do understand that payor mix and patient mix. We have a patient mix of commercial vision plans, Medicaid, Medicare, maybe a little bit of major medical, and then a little bit of cash pay. And we have a fairly diverse pool of patients regarding what they're coming into for primary care versus medical. Then over here, we have a practice that may be generating the same exact gross revenue, But over here, you have one commercial vision plan that so happens to be the best one for that market. And by the way, that is going to vary by market. I know in past episodes, we haven't even talked geospatial market analysis in this conversation, but that plays a huge role in all this stuff.
Yeah.
Who's in your market? What are they doing? How are we showing up to them? But tied over here, we're looking at that patient mix of, if we have this insurance practice over here, maybe we have one vision plan that we've aligned with strategically because of things that we know they're doing in the market. And then maybe one or two major medical plans that we've aligned with strategically because maybe we know there's a couple of big employers in town that have them. And oh yeah, we do have some cool equipment, OCTs, right, cameras to be able to do a lot of major medical care. And then, I don't know, maybe they've had a lot of fun doing specialty contact lenses. So in this practice over here, you got a lot of insurances with 15% cash pay. Over here, you've got just a few insurances, but they are strategic insurances, i.e. better reimbursements, right? But then you got 45% of the revenue coming in as cash. These two businesses looking identical. They may even have the same exact identical expenses. And maybe they're out of benchmark on expenses too. Maybe they do have their COGS or all the rails and all these other things. But you have these two practices with everything identical, but one of them simply has 3x the cash pay receivables. That is going to get a better price than that practice that does not have as much cash receivables.
Okay.
So it's important as we look at this, and we're not just growing revenue, but we're growing it in the right way.
In a way that's more sustainable. It improves the reliability of that revenue continuing.
Exactly.
Okay.
And by the way, this wouldn't be the case if we saw historically that healthcare, health insurance, and vision plan reimbursements were going up, then perhaps we'd be talking about something totally different. But the fact is, they're not. They are not. They are not. The brightest minds in the world of medical billing and coding, they're having to update their stuff multiple times a year to keep up with the changes. So think about that. How many resources are we expending trying to figure out what kind of modifier do we need to put on it this year?
Yeah.
For what? $2.50? Like, y'all, we can grow these businesses by a hell of a lot more than $2.50 at a time.
Okay, so I really like how you've broken this down. Ultimately, this all comes down to improving cash flow. And how do we do that? We can look at improving revenue. So that's cash dollars coming into the business. We can look at it in terms of improving expenses. We have these different expense categories we can impact in a variety of levels, which ultimately impacts earnings, which ultimately leads to cash flow. And a few just follow-up questions here. So, number one, for this single doctor, single owner practice, how much does hiring associate doctors impact the potential outcomes here when they're thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And this is all going to be really based on the need in the practice. There are a lot of practices out there right now that we've got sellers who are really ready to get out. So they are the single owner operator, but they are no longer working 5 days a week. Maybe they're only in their office seeing patients 2 days a week. Then they have fill-ins or associates seeing patients the other 2 or 3 days a week. So it's really important, though, that we look at this through a full-time equivalent lens.
Okay.
Right? And realizing that you got a $1.3 million practice with an owner-operator and then 2 associates. That's a single doctor practice.
Yeah.
I mean, I will tell you right now, it's a single doctor practice. If it's not a single doctor practice, something's wrong. And by the way, the only way it would be a non-single doctor practice at 1.3 rev is if rev per patient were so low that we really needed all of that coverage just to get the patient throughput. And if that's what's going on, there are other things that can be done to improve that business, actually pretty simply, believe it or not. But getting back to the whole thing regarding hiring associates, for these purposes, it's 6 one way, half dozen the other. Because really what we're looking at, we want to look at it through the lens of full-time equivalent. You want to pull in all of those wages. So any doctor wages, whether it's going to owner operator or those associates, we want to lump all of the doctor wages together. Okay. And evaluating the true cash flow of that. But I cannot stress it enough. It's really important we look at this through the lens of what is the actual required doctor coverage of this.
Got it. So some examples that come to mind hearing you talk about that are that if an owner is wanting to maybe bring down their time in the practice, but want to maintain a full-time equivalent amount of doctor hours in the practice to at least maintain or grow that gross revenue and earnings at the same rate, then that associate doctor might just fill in for the time the owner doctor wants to bring down for themselves. So that's keeping it within one full-time equivalent OD. And on another example is that if they want to move beyond one full-time equivalent OD because there's patient demand for it, then that additional associate is adding to the gross revenue and likely adding to the earnings and cash flow of the practice. So as I mentioned, two very different needs of the business, and that associate doctor is impacting it in two different ways.
Yes. Now, it is vital that appropriate doctor wages are being factored into these equations.
Gotcha.
Okay. And I know we didn't do a deep dive on exactly all the steps of how we construct a fair market valuation, but the importance of realizing that, hey, doctor owner many years, you're presumably in a position of paying yourself a good bit more than benchmark. As a matter of fact, according to the American Optometric Association, doctors in ownership earn upwards of 50% more than those that are not. So there's a lot of upside there. But it's really important that we look at this based on equivalence, right? And how those things factor into the valuation, because they will have a significant material impact. It's also vital that we are honest with ourselves about this stuff. So to think that we have a $2 million practice with a single FTE, that ain't going to cut it, right? To think, well, we have a $2 million practice with a single full-time doctor that we're paying $140,000 a year. No, I'm going to call shenanigans on that one. And presumably many people, the banks will call shenanigans on that one as well. So it's really important we look at this the right way to be sure we're pulling in the right add backs into the equation. And I'm realizing that is a topic that we had not touched on prior, but that is definitely something, Evon, I would love to spend a little bit of time touching on add backs, also talking about capital expenditure, because these are things that will have a material impact on that valuation of that practice.
So let's dive into add backs then. Let's talk about how add backs impact all this. What are add backs? Just run through what those are.
Yeah. So add backs are going to be adjustments made to the financials that reflect more of the true performance of the practice. So common add backs would be doctor salary, your single doctor owner, your tax team, your CPA, and your financial planner have you set up as drawing a salary out of your business. And let's say your salary that you're drawing, let's say you're a single doctor, single location, grossing $1 million. You're paying yourself a $300,000 a year salary. That's an expense to the business. But we're going to add that back. Why? You're the owner operator. So we're going to add back that $300K. Now, in so doing, we're also going to then pull out of the business, though, what? We got to pay a doctor to be in there. Mm-hmm. But this is a really good example where if you are an owner and you're paying yourself a $300,000 a year salary, first and foremost, congratulations. You got your business to a point where you can, your financial planner or CPA are advising you to pay yourself that. That's freaking amazing. Okay. And that's where then you realize you worked your tail off to get your business where you could pay yourself a $300,000 a year salary, but in your market, maybe we can hire in a full-time doctor for $150,000. So we'd add back that $300K salary of the owner, then we'd subtract out that $150K full-time equivalent. And that's going to show what? That's going to blow up the value of the business. Why? Because now we got that 150 delta, that $150,000 overage that the owner was paying themselves above what they would have paid a full-time fill-in. That now is going straight into profit. And that's a beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. So a few other things on add backs. Other add backs. I had mentioned earlier we were talking about the general business overhead, that we want that to be in 3 to 5%, but it's not uncommon that this is 8, 10, 12, hell, 18%. When do these occur? When you're living a good life through your business.
Yeah.
You're going on trips on your business. You're buying cars on your business. You got teenage kids that are learning how to drive. You got to buy a car. Hey, look, now the practice has another vehicle. Okay, so all that stuff, it feels good when you're there because it doesn't hit personal finance. You're not going to see any of those flow personal finance. It feels good. We've reduced some taxes for the tax year. But lo and behold, we realize that these are things that we're going to have to do add backs. We want to try to minimize add backs of seller discretionary spend. Why? Questions. Think about it. If you were going to go buy something and then you start getting all these additional details only after you submitted a letter of intent or something like that, you'd be like, what the hell's going on? Give me all the facts on the front end.
Right.
So in the world of add backs, it's also imperative that doctors understand the following. If your COGS are out of control, that's on you. There's no adjustment we can make to a valuation to justify the fact that you were overspending on COGS for all those years. If you pay below market rent, we have got to add back, or should I say adjust that rent to a market rent. For example, I own my building. I pay myself very little rent because that's just the way I've been doing things. You're paying yourself $1,500 a month rent. That's fine and good. You want to sell your practice, but market rent is, let's say market rent for a space your size would be $4,500 a month. We're going to have $36,000 of expense added into your financials to do what? Account for that. Unless you, as the owner of the real estate, were going to lease it to the new owner at a way below market rent, which I know you're not.
Yep.
So we need to be sure that's factored in. So it's really important that everyone understand that some of these expenses would do add backs to hit profitability. Some of these expenses we can get into doing adjustments, but other expenses we can't. Right? So rent is one. Another also that we really got to look at is that non-doctor payroll. For example, you're an established practice. It's you, a few staff members. Maybe one of those staff members is your spouse or a child, and you're paying them something other than what would be the right wage to pay. Maybe it's your spouse and they're not on payroll. So when we look at your benchmarks, your expenses, your non-doctor expense benchmark may be around 14%. The range is 18 to 24. We have got to move those expenses up into the range of what it should be. Why? We can't assume that the buyer is going to have a spouse that's going to work in the practice with no wage.
Right.
You're going
to have to replace that spouse.
Yeah, so we really have to be sure that the right adjustments are being made so that we can start negotiating around an actual fair market value that, by the way, is going to be the range that banks are looking for.
Yeah.
And that is how and why Evon Akrinos gets quite a bit of buyers contacting us after they signed a letter of intent. But then they engage with Akrinos and they get us all the financials and we run the valuation. We start doing the stuff. We are finding deals that are going to active sale for $150,000 and $200,000 below what that original asking price was. And there's a number of reasons for that. So it's really important that everybody get real about this stuff. It does no one any good when everybody's been working their tail off for the last 6 months, buyer and seller negotiating for the last 6 months, only to get to the bank saying, oh, we can't write that. It's not cash flowing sufficiently.
Yeah.
That does no one any good. No one any good. So it's really important also that our listeners out there that are prospective sellers eyeing the 5 to 10 year exit, really now is your time to start making these changes. Because when it comes to be go time, There are a lot of things at play that you're not going to have control over. But right now, when you're 5 to 10 years out, you have the opportunity to do what? Get those expense benchmarks under control. You have an opportunity to do what? Grow revenue, but grow it around a service mix and a payor mix that's going to drive value. Something else we didn't touch on at all, Evon. Capital expenditure. Mm-hmm. Sure, it's been a great practice for all these years, but oh my gosh, that exam lane looks like it was it's barely functioning. That OCT, you got to hit it on the side, do all these things just to get it to operate, right? If you follow where I'm going here, CapEx, we can't be selling something that needs new equipment, needs new furniture, all that inventory in the optical is old crap that nobody wants. We got to be sure that this thing it has merits.
Yeah.
Equipment and diagnostics, non-medical technology, right? Leaseholder improvements, furniture and fixtures. Know as a seller, 5 to 10 years out, know as a seller, you're not going to get away with it. You're not going to get away with selling something to the next generation that can barely function. It ain't going to happen. And by the way, it's not that it's not going to happen because if a buyer works with Akrinos and we're going to pick the practice apart, it's not going to. Banks are going to laugh you out of the office. Again, Evon, it's an amazing time we're living in right now, but I also feel like now more than ever, doctors really need to understand the facts. And the facts is not fluff. The facts is not coming from an online community. The facts are not coming from whatever ChatGPT or Claude or OpenAI or whatever the hell we're calling these days, what it's telling you. The facts are, this is how the system works. So it's really important to understand where you can have an impact on things so that your practice is set up so that when it goes through the system, it's going to be favorable for all parties.
One of the questions that I did have written down is, can you be too profitable if it shows that you're not investing in the practice? And you just touched on that, right? You may have a very profitable practice above and beyond benchmarks, but if the buyer is looking around and everything in the practice is outdated, you haven't invested in the practice for the last 10 years, that's going to impact the value, right? So it's an interesting question. I don't know how you feel about that, Erich, but maybe you just told us how you feel about that. It does seem like there's a point where you may be too profitable if it means you're not reinvesting back into the business. The way I want owners to think about this is that you have to market your practice for sale. You have to market it. And you have to present it and prepare it in a way to where a buyer is going to be as comfortable as possible, as ready as possible to step in and go to work. And if the future cash flows and the uncertainty or certainty of those future cash flows are what's going to determine some fair price, if you have all of these things in the business that make it very uncertain, or if the buyer is going to perceive that there's a lot of risk in this business for the same amount of revenues coming in or the same amount of profits coming in, that's going to impact that buyer's willingness to buy your business. And whether it's not having clean and accurate financial statements and record keeping, whether it's having out-of-date technology or equipments, if there's too many ad backs and too many questions start coming in, that buyer is going to start to feel like things are not very likely to continue on as they are. And so we got to prepare, and we can't sell the buyer on potential. If there's potential opportunity in the business, why aren't you taking advantage of that potential? Why aren't you doing it? So we have to think about it as something we need to market and sell, just like we prepare our houses, right? We're preparing our houses for market and for sale. Let's look at this really important asset that you've built up over years and decades, and let's get it ready so that the next buyer can step in and feel really confident about the revenues that you've built up and the earnings you've built up. And just out of respect to time, Erich, I think this is a pretty good place to stop. I've got a couple questions, but I think we'll tackle that on a future episode, specifically diving into valuations. But I know you have a resource for listeners of the show. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Evon, we've got a ton of resources, right? But we did put together something for listeners of your show, a little 360 due diligence asset. And basically what this is, it just kind of sets things up. If you are one of these listeners 5 years out, just some nice bullets looking at 5 to 3 years out, then 2 years out, then 1 year out, then 6 months out. kind of just some nice little things. You can have a little, just we'll say it, a little desktop reference for you as you're approaching those next few years. And look, Vaughn, if anybody would like to claim it, y'all can just reach out to Evon and he'll send you on over, or you can shoot us an email, contact@akrinos.com. Let us know that you tuned into this episode of Optometry Money Podcast, and we'll see about getting those assets on over to you.
Appreciate it, Eric. As always, it was a pleasure, and I will put all of your information and resources in the show notes. And for everyone, really appreciate your time. The earlier you can start planning here, both in the business and financially outside of the business, getting you ready for that point, the much more freedom and flexibility you're going to have as you get there. For everyone, really appreciate your time in listening today. We will catch you on the next episode. In the meantime, take care.
Want more resources to help master your money? Check out the Education Hub on Evon's website at optometrywealth.com. Evon Mindren is a certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, a California registered investment advisor. All opinions of Evon and his guests are their own. This show is for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for specific investment, legal, tax, or other decisions. Clients of OWA may own securities mentioned on this show.